5 months ago, my mother-in-law pointed at my 9-year-old daughter's laptop across her dining table and said, "Your cousin deserves it more. Hand it over." Lily pulled the computer against her chest and stared at Patricia as if she had misheard her. "But Grandma." Patricia's expression didn't move. "Then don't call me Grandma." Every fork at the table stopped. My husband pushed back his chair and stood. "Mom, answer one question first. Why did Lily's education trust pay Mason's tuition?" Across from him, my father-in-law went white. "Nathan," Walter said, "don't say it here." Before I tell you what Walter was so afraid of us saying out loud, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from, and stay with me because that dinner uncovered something much bigger than a laptop. If you enjoy family stories where the truth finally catches up with the people who thought they could control everyone, please subscribe and stay for what happened next. That Sunday dinner had started almost normally, at least by Hayes' family standards. Patricia had always compared Lily with her cousin Mason, but until that night, I had treated most of it as irritating rather than dangerous. Mason was 11, 2 years older than Lily. And Patricia talked about him as if every ordinary accomplishment proved he was destined for something extraordinary. Lily never seemed interested in competing with him. She liked building little machines, taking apart things Nathan wished she would leave alone, and spending hours figuring out why a piece of code refused to do what she wanted. That afternoon, she had been working on a robotics project with a friend, so she brought her laptop into Patricia's house rather than leave it in the car. The computer had cost Nathan and me about $1,600. It was expensive for a 9-year-old, and I knew that. But it wasn't a toy we had bought, because Lily begged for the newest thing. She used it for school, coding lessons, and robotics software that barely ran on the old family computer. Mason leaned over while Lily showed him a design program and asked a couple of questions. He didn't ask to borrow the laptop. He certainly didn't ask to have it. Patricia was the one who noticed the machine, asked what it had cost, and immediately turned the price into an accusation. $1,600, she repeated, for a child? Nathan looked up from his plate. She uses it for her robotics work. Patricia glanced at Mason. He has that old thing Heather bought used. Heather shifted in her chair. Mom, it's fine. It isn't fine. Patricia looked back at Lily. Mason is older. He needs a proper computer more than you do. I was already watching Lily because I knew that tone. Patricia had used versions of it before. Lily got a larger Christmas gift from us, so Patricia bought Mason too. Lily got accepted into a summer program, so Patricia spent 20 minutes explaining why Mason's school was more competitive. Those things had annoyed me, but I had made the mistake of treating them as background noise. I had told myself Lily had 2 parents who loved her and didn't need me turning every slight from her grandmother into a family war. Then Patricia held out her hand. Give it to him. For a second, I honestly thought she was making some awful joke. Patricia. She kept her hand out. Lauren, she has plenty. Mason deserves it more. Lily's shoulders tightened. Her fingers curled around the edges of the laptop. It's mine. I know whose it is, Patricia said. That's why I'm asking you to share. Mason looked horrified. Grandma, I don't need it. Patricia barely glanced at him. You don't have to ask for what you need. That's what family is supposed to notice. That sentence stayed with me later, because I eventually understood that Patricia wasn't responding to something Mason wanted. She was deciding for him what he needed, then deciding for Lily what she was required to give up. At the time, though, all I saw was my daughter's face changing as an ordinary dinner turned into a test she had never agreed to take. But Grandma, Lily whispered. Then don't call me Grandma. The room went so quiet I could hear the heating system click behind me. Lily's lower lip trembled. And that was the moment any concern I had about keeping the peace disappeared. I slid my chair closer, placed one hand over the closed laptop, and looked directly at Patricia. She is not giving you her computer. She is not giving it to Mason. This conversation is over. Patricia leaned back as if I had embarrassed her. This is exactly what I mean about the way you're raising her. She has more than enough, and she already thinks everything is hers. It is hers, I said. Before Patricia could answer, Nathan stood. 2 nights earlier, he and I had been going through financial records because we were updating our savings plans for Lily. That was when we found an education trust entry neither of us recognized. It was listed as academic enrichment, $4,875. We had paid for every coding camp and robotics program Lily had attended ourselves. Earlier that Sunday, Nathan had found an old family group message Heather had forwarded about a program Mason attended. The tuition amount was exactly the same. We didn't have enough evidence to accuse anyone, so we had planned to ask Patricia and Walter privately after dinner. Then Patricia told our daughter that Mason deserved her property more. Nathan looked at his mother. "Mom, answer one question first. Why did Lily's education trust pay Mason's tuition?" I already knew the question was coming. What I wasn't prepared for was Walter's reaction. His face drained so fast that for a second I thought he might be sick. He put down his glass and looked at Nathan instead of Patricia. "Don't say it here." Nathan stared at him. "Why not?" Patricia jumped in before Walter could answer. "Because you clearly don't understand what you're talking about." "Then explain it," Nathan said. "There is nothing to explain. That money is for education." "Lily's education?" Patricia gave a short, irritated sigh. "All of these children are family. You and Lauren have never had to worry about paying for Lily. Heather has. Sometimes money needs to go where it can actually help." That was the first time she said it plainly enough for me to hear the philosophy underneath everything else. Lily had more, therefore Lily could lose more. Nathan and I could replace things, therefore Patricia believed taking them caused no real harm. I didn't know yet how far she had taken that belief, but I knew I wasn't going to investigate it while my 9-year-old sat there wondering whether her grandmother still loved her. I closed the laptop, handed it securely to Lily, and stood. "We're leaving." Patricia blinked. "Lauren, don't be dramatic. You told my child not to call you grandma because she wouldn't surrender something that belongs to her. We're not finishing dinner." Lily reached for my hand. Nathan was already collecting our coats. Mason looked miserable and repeated, "I really don't want her laptop," but Patricia told him none of this was his fault. For once, she and I agreed on something. It wasn't his fault, and I wasn't going to let the adults in that room turn two children against each other, because one grandmother had decided fairness meant taking from whichever child she believed could afford the loss. At home, after Lily was settled upstairs, Nathan and I sat at the kitchen table with 3 years of annual trust packages spread between us. I used to be proud of how little attention I paid to that money. Nathan's grandfather had created the education trust for Lily, but Nathan and I paid for her life ourselves. I thought not hovering over the balance proved I wasn't interested in his family's money. That night, for the first time, I understood there was a difference between refusing to depend on an asset and failing to protect an asset that belonged to my child. We reopened the entry for $4,875. Then I pulled up the transaction appendix attached to the previous year's report. There were legitimate expenses I recognized, but there were also vendor names I had never seen before. I marked the first one as unknown, then another, then another. Nathan sat beside me in silence until I reached the bottom of the page. "What?" he asked. I turned the statement toward him. That tuition payment wasn't the only one. By midnight, we had a list of education charges neither of us could explain. And for the first time since Walter had gone pale at that dinner table, I stopped wondering whether Patricia had crossed a line once. I started wondering how long she had believed Lily's future was hers to redistribute. By the next morning, our kitchen table looked less like a place where a family ate breakfast and more like a temporary audit room. Nathan had gone back through every annual package we still had in our files, while I built a spreadsheet with 5 columns: date, amount, vendor, what we knew the expense was for, and whether we recognized it as something Lily had actually used. I refused to label anything stolen. Not yet. Every transaction I couldn't explain went into one category: unknown. If I was going to accuse my mother-in-law of using my daughter's trust for another child, I wanted facts strong enough that Patricia couldn't turn the entire thing into another argument about my attitude. The hardest part was admitting how much of the problem I had helped leave unexamined. For years, I had been proud that Nathan and I didn't need the Hayes money. We paid Lily's school costs ourselves. We paid for her camps, her activities, her laptop, her clothes, everything she needed. Nathan's grandfather had created the education trust before he died, and in my mind, it belonged to some distant version of Lily who would need tuition years from now. I had treated not touching the money as proof that I wasn't
dinner.
interested in
And
it.
every time he
Walgreens
offered to
3
help,
times that month
Rachel,
on
his
3
younger
different
sister,
attempts to reach
would
my
deflect
grandmother.
with phrases like,
Not
Every
"Don't
time the
worry,
door had
Mom's
closed,
got it."
didn't mean
I
I had the
realized
world
Or, "We're
then
trying to
that my
keep it
parents
small."
had not
He'd
panicked.
chalked
They
it
had
up to wedding
diagnosed
stress.
it.
He
had
told
planned
himself
for it.
not to
They
take it
had a script
personally,
ready before
but
Granny
now,
moved in.
seeing it in
They had
writing
told the
final,
hospice staff their version of
unapologetic,
me
He
long
something
before the
inside
first
him
opioid
shifted.
was prescribed.
Ethan didn't respond.
I drove home
He didn't
that
ask
night
why.
and cried in the
He
bathtub
didn't
with the
demand an
water running so
explanation.
the neighbors wouldn't
Instead, he
hear.
stood up,
Before we know what we're looking for. Nathan leaned back and rubbed both hands over his face. He hated that I was right, which I understood because I hated it too. Confronting Walter would have felt good. It might even have produced an explanation. But an explanation wasn't the same thing as evidence, and after what Patricia had said to Lily, I was done relying on whatever version of events the Hayes family decided was easiest to live with. Patricia started texting before 8 that morning. She didn't apologize for what she had said to Lily. Instead, she accused me of making a private family disagreement into a spectacle. She said Lily was being raised to believe she never had to share. She reminded Nathan that Heather had struggled financially for years, then added that Mason had fewer advantages through no fault of his own. The message that told me the most was almost buried in the middle. You two can replace anything Lily ever needs. Heather can't do that for Mason. I saved it without replying. Nathan wanted to answer immediately, but I shook my head. She's arguing about whether she was justified. We still don't know exactly what she did. Then Patricia tried to reach Lily through the family messaging app we used for photos and birthday plans. Nathan saw the notification first. I took the tablet before Lily came downstairs and read only the preview. Patricia had written that she hoped Lily would understand how important it was to share with family. I didn't open the rest with Lily beside me. Nathan and I agreed Patricia would not contact her directly until she could communicate through us without turning a 9-year-old into the person responsible for fixing an adult conflict. We didn't block Patricia from contacting us. We simply removed Lily from the conversation. After breakfast, Nathan pulled the trust instrument from the family files his grandfather's attorney had given him years earlier. I had seen the document before and understood almost none of it. This time we read the relevant sections
I
carefully.
have been an ICU
Patricia
nurse
and
for
Walter
8
were
years.
co-trustees.
I know
But the
exactly
trust
what
didn't require both of
1.5
them to
milligrams per
approve
hour
every
of morphine
educational
does to an
expense.
82-year-old woman
Direct
in
payments to
post-op day
schools,
2.
camps,
I
tutoring
looked at the
programs,
IV pump.
and education
I looked at
vendors
Brenda.
under $5,000
Brenda
could be authorized
looked at the
by either
IV pump.
trustee acting
I
alone,
said quietly,
as long as
the way
that
you talk in a
trustee
room with a
certified the
sleeping
expense was
patient.
for the named
Brenda,
beneficiary.
she's on a
Reimbursements to
1.5
family
milligram
members,
morphine
cash
drip.
equivalent payments,
You can't
and
notarize
amounts
this.
over $5,000
You know you can't.
required both trustees.
right away.
My father
Nathan
in
Ethan
a
just
charcoal
sat there
suit
for a
on the
while,
steps of First
phone
Baptist
face
Street.
down on the table,
The Purple
letting the
Heart
silence in
lapel.
his apartment
The
stretch
bright
as far as it
Sunday
needed
sun.
to.
The
The stillness
caption
wasn't
read,
uncomfortable. He was
Mama
used
would
to
be
it.
so
He had
proud.
lived most of his life
She
in
let
that
it sit on
same
the
quiet
screen for 10
space
seconds.
emotionally, at
She
least
did not
even when
say
the rooms
anything.
around him were
She did
full of
not
people who
say
shared his
Patricia had
last name.
legitimate
My father
authority
That
looked at
message
the
from his
window.
dad was a ripple,
Then Annabelle
but
placed
not
the
yet a
voice down.
wave.
She had
Not
done it
yet.
by
grandmother's
design.
voice
Ethan
came
had
out of the
learned
conference
early
room
that
speakers
being
and filled the
quiet
room
was
the way it
easier
filled
than
the
being
dining
Regional bank that acted as custodian and record keeper. It didn't decide what counted as an appropriate expense. The trustees sent payment instructions, and the bank maintained the transaction history, vendor information, invoice references, and authorization logs. Nathan called the service number listed on the statements and asked what records a parent of a minor beneficiary could request. The representative wouldn't discuss specific transactions over the phone without verification, which actually reassured me. After confirming
She did not
Nathan's
ask how I
identity
was.
and the account
She said,
relationship, she told
Lily,
him how to submit a
you
written
embarrassed
request
Mom
for
in
the
front of a
complete
hospital
annual accounting
nurse.
packages,
She'll never forgive
transaction
you.
exports,
Just stay
payment
away.
instructions,
It's better for
and
everyone.
trustee authorization history.
I did not call
How
my
long?
sister again for
Nathan
26
asked.
months.
A few business
In the
days,
summer of
depending on the old
2024,
records.
Cassandra texted
That
me from
answer
a coffee
frustrated
shop
him,
in Greer.
but I preferred
Lily,
it to some magical
Granny
folder
moved into
appearing in
Mom
our
and Dad's
inbox
house
5
last
minutes
week.
later.
They're saying it's
We
just
submitted
until
the
she gets
request
stronger.
and went back to what
She's
We
not
all
going
agreed
back
you're
to
not
Travelers.
welcome.
The annual packets were more detailed than I remembered. The first page summarized categories and balances, which was the only part Nathan had usually looked at. Attached behind it was a transaction appendix listing vendors and reference information. Neither of us had paid enough attention to those pages because we hadn't been using the trust. I could blame Patricia for abusing access if the records proved that. But I couldn't blame the bank for hiding statements we had received and barely read. By afternoon, my spreadsheet had grown.
I packed my evidence
Some
folder.
entries were easy to
I
identify.
remember the temperature of my 35 miles. I remember Granny in the doorway with a ham
Sophia
platter.
from the parking
Another
lot,
not
favorite
looking at her
educational
daughter.
software we
I
both
not
remembered
looking at
was
me.
Sophia.
Walking
Almost
past
time.
with the platter to
Then
the
they
table
were
as
as
if
if
the
neither
room
of
had
us
been
were
She wrote
silent.
back.
See,
One
she
entry
knew.
used initials
She
instead
had
of
known.
full
For
program
years.
names.
I walked into
In
Sterling 2009, my
staircase
grandfather
rooms,
Henry died of
Then
complications. My
opened
sister
up
was
some
already
Agent
at the
Orange
table with our
exposure
family
that the
attorney
VA
had
had
spent
Heather said
35
something about
years.
Mason's
The committee
program
was
last
assembling
year.
on the other.
He searched the family group thread, scrolling past birthday photos, school announcements, and Patricia's endless reminders about Sunday dinners. Finally, he stopped. There. Heather had forwarded a tuition reminder for an enrichment academy because Patricia had asked whether anyone wanted to attend Mason's end-of-term showcase. The academy name matched the initials in Lily's transaction appendix. I felt my stomach tighten, but I still didn't say Heather knew. I still didn't say Patricia had stolen anything. Nathan opened the attachment. The tuition amount was $4,875. The same number sat in my spreadsheet under Lily's trust. I checked the dates. The trust payment had gone out within the same week as Mason's tuition deadline. Vendor matched. Amount matched. Timing matched. Nathan looked at me. That's not a coincidence. No, I said. But it's still not the whole answer. He nodded, though neither of us liked waiting. We had enough now to know the question at Patricia's dinner table had not come from a bookkeeping misunderstanding. What we didn't know was who else knew where that money came from, how many times it had happened, or whether Walter's panic meant he had helped Patricia or simply discovered the truth too late. I added the transaction to the spreadsheet, but I didn't mark it unknown anymore. I changed the label to Mason Program, source to be verified, then saved the file twice. By then, I wasn't interested in winning an argument with Patricia. I wanted a chain of facts strong enough that nobody in that family could ever again tell Lily that what belonged to her was available simply because someone else had less. By the end of that week, Patricia had already started telling the family her version of what happened. I knew because the messages came to Nathan first. One aunt asked why he was turning help for Heather into a scandal. A cousin wrote that Patricia had always stepped in when someone needed something and said we should be grateful. Lily had never known that kind of struggle. Nathan showed me both messages without answering, then set his phone face down on the counter. She got there first, he said. She usually does. What do you want me to say? I thought about sending screenshots, the matching tuition amount, the trust entry, Patricia's messages about Lily having more than enough. It would have taken 5 minutes to build a case, convincing enough for most relatives. But we still didn't know the whole story, and I wasn't going to turn Lily's finances into family entertainment just because Patricia had decided to recruit an audience. Tell them we're reviewing Lily's trust, and we'll discuss facts when we have them. Nathan typed exactly that. No accusations, no defense of my personality, no argument over whether Heather had suffered more than we had. Patricia wanted the conversation to become about generosity, because generosity sounded noble. I wanted to know whether money legally set aside for my daughter had been used for someone else. The bank sent the first batch of records the following Monday. They weren't dramatic. There was no red warning stamp, no memo saying unauthorized payment, no magical line that solved everything. What we got was a transaction export showing dates, amounts, vendor names, reference numbers, and the trustee account used to authorize each instruction. That was enough. The $4,875 payment had gone directly to the same enrichment academy Heather's email named Patricia's trustee account had initiated it. Walter's name did not appear anywhere on that payment. A second vendor entry we couldn't identify had also been initiated under Patricia's account. Then another. Nathan sat beside me while I highlighted each one. So Dad really may not have signed these. Not these direct payments, but Mom did. She authorized them. We still need to know what she certified. The distinction mattered. The records showed action, not yet the full story behind the action. Patricia had legitimate access as a trustee. The question was whether she had knowingly used that access for Mason while representing the expenses as Lily's. Nathan wanted to call Heather next. I didn't argue, but I knew I was carrying more suspicion toward her than the documents justified. Heather had spent years being rescued by Patricia. Late rent once. School expenses another time. A car repair. Mason's camps. Whenever something went wrong, Patricia stepped in and later reminded everyone how much she had done. I had watched that cycle so many times that it was easy to imagine Heather accepting help without asking where it came from. That assumption made me uncomfortable because I knew exactly what it was. Confirmation bias wearing the clothes of common sense. I texted Heather instead of calling. I asked if she could meet me alone. She waited almost 3 hours before replying. Her first message was short. "Is this about Mom helping with Mason's school?" I read it twice. Nathan saw my face. "What?" I handed him the phone. "That sounds bad," I said. "It sounds like she knows Mom paid. It sounds like she knows more than that. Maybe, maybe not." I hated how careful he was being because the sentence had landed directly on a suspicion I already wanted confirmed. I typed back that, yes, it was about Mason's school and Lily's trust, and I wanted to understand what Heather knew. She didn't answer. Not that afternoon, not that evening. By then, Patricia had sent Nathan another long email. Most of it was emotional accounting. She listed the things she had done for both of her children, reminded Nathan that Heather had raised Mason with fewer resources, and accused us of treating family help like theft. Then she wrote a sentence that made me stop scrolling. "You and Lauren can replace anything Lily ever needs. Heather can't." I saved the email immediately. It still didn't prove the earlier trust payments were improper. Patricia wrote it after the dinner, after she knew what we were questioning, but it was the same argument she had used over the laptop. Lily could lose because we could replace. Mason deserved more because Heather had less. Nathan read the line over my shoulder. "She really doesn't hear herself." "I think she hears herself perfectly." I almost said she believed every word. Then I stopped. I couldn't know what Patricia believed privately. What I knew was that she kept using the same justification whenever something belonging to Lily became part of the discussion. That evening, I found the laptop still sitting on the dining room table, where Lily had left it after school. She had been using it every day before Patricia's dinner. Coding exercises, homework, the robotics model she had been trying to make turn without tipping over. Now it had barely moved. "You done with your project?" I asked. Lily shrugged. "I can use the computers at school." "You like your laptop better." "It's okay." I heard the flatness in her voice and still let the answer go too easily. At the time, I told myself I didn't want to push her while everything was raw. Looking back, I know part of me was simply too focused on statements, dates, and records to recognize that Lily had already started turning Patricia's cruelty inward. I went back to the kitchen and added Patricia's email to the folder. The next morning, Heather finally replied. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop 2 days later. Then, a few minutes after that, she sent another message.
Then I noticed the
"I want you
woman
to see this
standing
first."
2 feet behind
There was
Patty.
a screenshot attached from a
Light blue
conversation
scrubs.
between her and Patricia,
Name tag
almost
Brenda
2 years
Markham,
earlier.
RN.
Heather had sent a photo
I didn't
of an
recognize
invoice for
her from
Mason's
this floor.
enrichment program.
She wasn't a
On the
circulating
end,
nurse.
she had written that
She wasn't a
hated
charge
asking
nurse,
for help again.
but she had a notary
Patricia's
stamp in her
response
hand.
was immediate.
A lot of South
"Send me
Carolina
the
nurses
invoice.
pick up a notary
Your father and
commission
I are
for
covering it."
$50 of
I
side
stared at the
income.
date. Then I
Patty
opened
had
my
clearly
spreadsheet.
arranged it ahead
The
of
trust payment
time.
had gone out that same
She had been
week.
waiting for the
I checked the
morphine.
amount, $4,875. Nathan came over when he saw me stop typing. "What is it?" I turned the phone toward him. For the first time since we started looking through the records, my suspicion of Heather weakened instead of growing. If the screenshot was genuine, Patricia hadn't told her the money came from Lily at all. She had told Heather it came from her and Walter. That changed the question completely. Heather might still have known more than she was admitting. She might have learned the truth later. She might have suspected and chosen not to ask. I wasn't ready to clear her based on one screenshot, but I was no longer willing to assume she had been part of the plan. I saved the image, noted the date, and compared it again with the bank export. Patricia's authorization, Mason's vendor, Lily's trust, Heather's message asking for help, Patricia's reply promising that she and Walter would cover it. The pieces didn't yet tell me exactly what had happened, but they told me something important. Patricia had not just moved money. She had controlled the story about where that money came from. And if Heather truly believed her parents were paying Mason's tuition themselves, then the person I had found easiest to blame might not have been the person I needed to be watching at all. I met Heather at a coffee shop on the north side of Columbus 2 days later. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in the corner with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she clearly hadn't touched. For years, I had thought of Heather as someone who let Patricia solve too much for her. Rent trouble, school expenses, car repairs, unexpected fees, Patricia always seemed to appear with money before Heather had to figure out another way. I had resented that pattern more than once, especially when Patricia used Heather's struggles as proof that Nathan and I were somehow less deserving of help because we were doing fine. But as I sat across from her, I reminded myself that dependence and dishonesty were not the same thing. Heather looked at me before I even took off my coat. I didn't know it was Lily's money. I sat down
60
slowly.
years, your sister will be dismissed from medical school. There was the singer. She will never become a doctor. And there was the small cedar box. Is that what Lily would want? She called. Lily would want both of you. She never let me open that one.
For a moment,
Lily would want healing. You'll know what to do with the important box when the time comes family apart. By the time I was a teenager, I had a private theory that my mother hated this room. Your father Patty performed Christianity the way some women perform yoga. At 11:23, my father texted me separately in front of the right people.
Did Dad? No. Did you ever see Lily's trust statements? No. Did Mom ever ask you to sign anything involving Lily? Heather shook her head. Never. Did she ask you for invoices? All the time. That answer made me sit straighter. Heather began scrolling through old messages. What she showed me was not one isolated conversation. It was a pattern. Patricia would ask what Mason's school needed, whether there was an upcoming program, whether a deposit was due, whether Heather had paid yet. Heather would send an invoice or say she was trying to work something out. Patricia would respond with some version of the same sentence. Your father and I have it. Let us handle it. This is what family is for. Heather stopped on a message from almost 18 months earlier. She had written, I appreciate it, but I can't keep letting you pay for everything. I need to figure this out myself. Patricia had answered, Don't be ridiculous. You're raising a child alone. Let us help while we can. Heather gave a short, humorless laugh. At the time, that sounded kind. It probably felt kind. It felt like relief. She looked down. That's the part I hate admitting. I understood what she meant. Relief can silence questions you might ask under different circumstances. It didn't make Heather responsible for what Patricia had done, but I could see how Patricia had built a system where nobody had much incentive to look behind the help. I asked Heather to open the original invoice from the screenshot she had sent me. She searched her email until she found the PDF and forwarded it to me. The Enrichment Academy name matched the vendor abbreviation in Lily's trust records. The amount was $4,875. The due date and trust payment fell within the same week. I looked at the invoice, then at Heather. This is the payment we found. Her face changed. You're sure? The amount matches exactly. The vendor matches, the timing matches. Patricia authorized the payment from Lily's account. Heather leaned back as if the chair had moved under her. She told me Dad was paying. I know. I sent her that invoice because I thought she was using their money. I know. Lauren, I would not have taken money from Lily. The old version of me might have answered too quickly. I might have said I believed her because I wanted to end the discomfort. Instead, I stayed with the facts. I believe you didn't know about this payment, I said. I still need to understand whether there were others. Heather nodded. Fair. That response mattered. She didn't demand instant absolution. She opened another folder instead. As we went through old school emails, another piece of Patricia's behavior became clearer. She had not merely responded to Mason's emergencies. Sometimes she had created urgency where Heather saw none. There was a technology program Mason had wanted to quit after the first month because he hated it. Heather had told Patricia she wasn't going to pay for the next session. Patricia had answered that Mason was too young to understand what opportunities mattered and offered to cover it herself. There had been an academic weekend retreat Heather thought was unnecessary. Patricia had insisted it would open doors. He didn't even want half of this stuff, Heather said. Mom always said I was thinking too small. That reminded me of the dinner. Mason told her he didn't want Lily's laptop. Heather nodded immediately. He told me the same thing in the car after you left. He was upset because he thought Lily was going to think he asked for it. He didn't. I know, I told him that. Heather, this matters. Patricia keeps saying she's doing things because Mason needs them. But Mason didn't ask for the laptop, and you didn't ask for some of these programs. Heather stared at her phone. She decides what counts as needing something. That was exactly it. For years, Patricia had framed herself as the person who noticed what everyone else failed to notice. If Heather hesitated, Patricia called it pride. If Mason wasn't interested in an opportunity, Patricia called it immaturity. If Nathan and I said Lily was fine with what she had, Patricia called it privilege. In every version, Patricia was the only person qualified to decide what should happen next. I was about to ask Heather about another invoice when Nathan called. I almost let it go to voicemail because I didn't want the meeting interrupted. But I saw the message he had sent 10 minutes earlier. Found something older. Call me. I answered. What did you find? Nathan didn't waste time. The bank sent another batch of records. Heather looked at me sharply. Which records? Payment instructions from 3 years ago. There's one that doesn't look like the others. I put the call on speaker after asking Heather if she was comfortable. She nodded. Nathan continued. Most of Mom's later payments went directly to vendors and were under $5,000, just like the trust language allows one trustee to authorize. But this older one was different. It was a reimbursement. To Heather? I asked. Yes. Heather's face went pale. How much? Just under $3,000. She closed her eyes. I know what that was. I waited. Mason had a school deadline. I was short because my car had needed repairs the week before. Mom told me she and Dad would cover the program and I could pay them back if I wanted. Nathan said, the payment instruction shows the money came from Lily's trust. Heather pressed a hand against her forehead. No, there's more, Nathan said. I felt my stomach tighten. What? Because it was a reimbursement to a family member, it required both trustees to approve. Heather looked at me. I already knew what Nathan was about to say. Mom approved it, he said. Dad did too. The coffee shop suddenly felt too loud. Cups hitting counters, someone laughing near the door, the milk steamer screaming behind the bar. Ordinary sounds continuing while something in Nathan's family shifted shape. Are you sure? I asked. I have the authorization record open in front of me. Could someone have used Dad's login? The bank sent a scanned instruction too. His approval is there. Heather whispered. Dad knew? We don't know what he knew beyond that payment, I said. Nathan was quiet for a second. But he knew enough to approve money from Lily's trust going to Heather. Heather's eyes filled, though she didn't cry. I thought they paid me back themselves. I believed her now. Not because I had decided to trust her emotionally, but because the records kept supporting the same version. Patricia asked Heather for invoices. Patricia told her the money came from Patricia and Walter. Patricia authorized direct payments. Heather had no trust access. Now, an older reimbursement showed Walter's approval too. I asked Nathan to send me the scanned instruction. A few seconds later, it
But
appeared
Granny
on
knew
the
the
phone.
difference.
I
Lily, she
opened it.
said, on the
Patricia
evening of
said
April
there.
7th, the
She
night
said it
before
the
the
way she
hearing,
said everything
Juliet
important
called
signature.
me, slow. Her voice was
So
brilliant but
mysterious
cracked
bank
and
records.
blunt. Elizabeth,
No
she did
half
not repeat
repeats.
herself. I will
My
lose
father-in-law
everything.
had
You weren't
no
paying
intention
attention. I will
of
lose
money
Yale.
from
The
Lily's
lesson moved
trust
on without
for
you.
an
Future.
expense
Over
that
the next
belonged to
20
Nathan.
years,
She
you walked
told
me
me
through
what
what
was
was in a
the
cedar
plan.
box on the table.
Why
I
would
said,
Dad do
and
that
what would
again?
one day
I thought
be?
it was
You did
his
not make us
mistake.
on the high
The way
shelf.
he had
You
gone
wrote
white
5,000
before
words
11
about
letters
a child
my
my
grandfather
grandfather Henry had written
letters.
her.
The way
I
he had
unfolded
said,
it. Lily, pencil,
"Don't say
call
it
this
here."
woman. A child holding the
What are
hand
you
of a
talking
woman
about?
in 14
I
days,
think
I had
that's what
not
he
been
was
both
afraid
of them
of.
looking
I
at each
said.
other. For 14 days,
Nathan
I had been
texted
on the
on
back
the
who
phone.
still
In
hoped her
shaky
mother
tones,
would
say
say
something
something true.
Yes,
For when
but
you
not
graduated,
with
my
Mom
mother
in the
had just
room.
answered
Lily,
the question
looked
for
at
age
me.
9. I set
Do
the
you still
alarm.
think
I
I was
took a
part of the
photograph
plan?
of it where it
I
lay.
answered
Tomorrow I
carefully.
would drive
I closed the
100
door.
miles
Think
south
you
on
accepted
I-20
more
original
offers to
in the inner
respond?
pocket of my
I
Augusta
could.
Road in
I think
Greenville. I went
Patricia used that
downstairs.
dependence.
I would
The
meet a
whole
woman my
family was in the
grandmother had
dining
been
room.
sitting across
No,
from
I don't
Juliet
think I
had
was
been
16
notified
years
by the
old.
Yale Committee on
Heather nodded slowly. I can live with that. I could too. It would have been easy to hold on to my old resentment because it made the story simpler. Heather received the benefits, so Heather must have been part of the wrongdoing. But simple wasn't the same as true, and if I wanted to protect Lily, I couldn't afford to build my decisions around the version that made me feel most justified. Before we left, Heather forwarded me every relevant invoice and message she could find. I sent copies to Nathan and added them to my evidence folder. The $4,875 payment was no longer just a suspicious line on a statement. It had a real invoice, a real program, a real student, and a real message from Patricia, falsely telling Heather that she and Walter were covering the cost. Then there was the older reimbursement. Walter's approval sat beneath Patricia's. As I walked back to my car, one question pushed everything else aside. Nathan had asked his mother why Lily's trust paid
Marilyn,
tuition.
we all
So my
agreed you're
sister
not
could
welcome
come.
at the wedding.
3 days
No
later,
punctuation,
the hospice
no
coordinator
explanation.
from Interim
Just that
Healthcare
smug
agreed
little
to
dash
call
she
me.
always
Polite
used in
voice,
place of a period.
Southern,
Ethan
careful.
stared at the
Ms.
message,
Slater,
unsure
your
if his
parents
eyes
have
were playing
indicated
tricks
that
on
for the
him.
patient's
He read
emotional
it again.
stability,
Then
certain
again.
family
The
members
words
should
didn't
not
change.
visit
It
unannounced.
wasn't entirely a
I'm
shock,
so
though.
sorry.
The signs
This is
had
a
been there
family
subtle,
decision we have to
accumulating over
respect.
months. He hadn't been
I sat in the
included in the
parking
group
lot of
photo
Walgreens
planning,
with the call
hadn't
on the
received an
dashboard
invite to the
speakers.
engagement.
I told Nathan before we left that I would listen to whatever Walter had to say, but I was not interested in hearing that everyone had made mistakes or that Patricia had only been trying to help. We had records now. We had Heather's invoices. We had Walter's approval on the first reimbursement. If he wanted to explain himself, he was going to have to explain facts. Walter was already seated when we arrived. He looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier. Not dramatically older, not sick, just worn down in a way that made me think he had spent every night since dinner waiting for this conversation. Nathan sat across from him. I took the chair beside Nathan and put my notebook on the table. Walter looked at it. "You're taking notes?" "Yes." His mouth tightened, but he nodded. Nathan didn't ease into it. "Why did you approve money from Lily's trust for Mason?" Walter looked down at his hands. It was supposed to be one time. The sentence was so close to what I had expected that it irritated me immediately. Nathan leaned forward. "One time what?" 3 years ago, Heather called your mother because Mason had a deadline for a school program. She was short almost $3,000. Her car had broken down, and she had already used what she had saved. "We know that part," I said. "Heather told us." Walter looked at me, then back at Nathan. "Your mother said we should help." "That still doesn't explain Lily's trust," Nathan said. Walter took a long breath. "Patricia said we could borrow from
Or
her,
anything
stealing her
else
life.
in your
Money back
family's
is
I replied
possession.
with one sentence. Anything
Nathan
physical,
stared at him.
actually
Borrow.
connected to
Call
Lily.
Grandma's
Grandma's
lawyer
lawyer
and
and I knew
ask
the
who she
answer.
really
trusted.
There
I
it
just
was.
did not
The
know
next
where it
morning,
was yet. It wasn't my lawyer who called.
No
I
claim
called
that Walter
Sophia
thought
that
the
night.
expense belonged to
His
Lily.
voice
I had
not called her in 4
Ma'am,
months.
continued
We
before she
need to
picked
talk.
up
Nervous.
Right
The way
now.
she
Lily was
always
6.
picked up when
They
she
thought
did not
they had
recognize
warned
the
her
number
doing
on the
well.
screen. They had no idea,
Mason
but
had
every
recognized the
cruel
name.
thing they did in
Patricia
that
said
hospital.
it was
Sophia
temporary.
I had been watching them the
I
whole
need to ask you
time.
something. Walter
My
nodded.
name is
Did you
Lily
ever
Slater
know
in
the
person.
trust
33.
named Lily as the beneficiary? Yes. Even though the expense was Mason's? Yes. Nathan pushed his chair back an inch, then stopped himself. "Dad? Why?" Walter looked at him with something close to embarrassment. "Because, at the time, it felt easier to fix one problem than create 5 more. Nathan laughed once without humor. "You mean it was easier than telling Mom no?" Walter didn't deny it. He explained that because the first payment was a reimbursement to Heather, the trust terms required both trustees to approve it. Patricia filled out the instruction. Walter reviewed it. He knew exactly where the money was coming from and exactly who it was benefiting. He told himself the amount was small compared with the trust balance and that he would personally make sure it was restored. I asked the question I had been waiting to ask. "Did you put it back?" "Not immediately." Nathan's expression hardened. Walter lifted a hand. "I planned to." But a few months later, Patricia made another payment. That one went directly to a program. "For Mason," I said. "Yes." "From Lily's trust?" "Yes." "Did you approve that one?" "No." Walter explained what Nathan and I had already learned from the trust document. Direct educational vendor payments under $5,000 could be authorized by one trustee. After the first reimbursement, Patricia started using that route. Walter said he did not realize right away how often she was doing it because he wasn't reviewing every transaction as closely as he should have. "That sounds familiar," I said. Walter looked at me. "I didn't review the statements closely enough either. The difference is I didn't have fiduciary responsibility over the account." He lowered his eyes. Nathan asked, "When did you find out?" "A little over a year later." "And what did you do?" Walter hesitated too long. Nathan's voice changed. "What did you do?" I confronted her. "And?" She said Mason needed the programs more than Lily needed the money. I felt my jaw tighten. Walter continued. "I told her to stop." "Did she?" "No." "What did you do then?" That was the part Walter had clearly been dreading. "I started putting money back." Nathan went completely still. Walter said he had used money from an investment account he controlled to make deposits back into Lily's subtrust. Not enough to cover everything, and not in one payment. He had tried to reduce the damage quietly whenever he noticed a suspicious distribution. Nathan stared at him. How much? About $5,000 total. You knew enough to put $5,000 back, but not enough to tell us what she was doing? Walter flinched. That's what this is? Nathan said. You saw Mom taking money from our daughter, and your solution was to secretly refill the account? I thought I could correct it. No, Dad, you thought you could hide it. Walter's face tightened. I was trying to protect everyone. From what? From this. Nathan gestured between us. This happened because you protected it. Walter looked at me as if he expected me to soften what Nathan had said. I didn't. You were repairing the balance because stopping Patricia would have meant admitting what you allowed the first time, I said. As long as you could put some money back, you could tell yourself the family wasn't really being harmed. Walter stared at the table. I knew the accusation was harsh. I also knew it was true enough that he didn't challenge it. After a while, Walter said, That's why I told Nathan not to say it at dinner. Nathan's expression didn't change. Because you were protecting Mom. No. Walter looked up. Because Heather and Mason were sitting there. I knew. If you kept asking questions, the next question was going to be whether I knew. You did. Yes. And you didn't want Heather to hear that. I didn't want her to find out
through
that way.
hospital security under the Internal Volunteer Coordination Audit Policy. She had been at Boston Children's 24 years.
The entire
They
conversation
trusted
was
her.
beginning to
The
fit
first
together in a
file
way
was
I
my
couldn't.
patient navigator
Patricia
log.
had opening
3,200 total
intelligence.
hours across
Battery
my
saves
caseload.
power, and updates are automatic.
1,180 of those hours were
interrupts you.
specifically with Lily Donovan
Dell
and her
Pro
mother.
Wounds.
Bedside reading, translation,
Patricia had turned
family
one exception
conferences,
into a method.
hospice support.
We're Phoenix
After
Energy,
hours
a
visits
family-owned.
Had tried to make the numbers less ugly. He had not been the architect, but he had helped keep the building standing. I asked him whether Patricia knew he had been replacing money. At first, she told me I was being ridiculous. She said if I wanted to put money back, that was my choice. Did she ever admit the payments were wrong? Walter looked at me for several seconds before answering. Not in the way you mean. I took that in. What way did she mean? She said she understood the trust technically belonged to Lily, but she didn't believe it was fair to leave that much available to one child when another child in the same family needed opportunities. Nathan leaned back. So she knew. Yes. There was no hesitation that time. Walter reached for his phone. There's something else. He scrolled through an old message thread and held the phone toward Nathan. I saved this because it was the first time I realized she wasn't talking about an emergency anymore. Nathan read it, then handed the phone.
Phone lit up again.
We're going to
The
play
message
3
was
things.
message.
Annabelle
Nathan
said.
This
and
time,
Lauren can
it
replace
wasn't
Then we're
from
going to
Marilyn.
talk.
ever needs.
It wasn't
She
from
started
Rachel.
clip 3.
It wasn't even
My
from one
mother
of the
watched
cousins,
variations of
who
his
likely
on a
had no
wall-mounted
idea
screen
what had
in a
just happened.
stranger's conference
It was
room.
from his father,
Slide her
Thomas
own
Miller.
mother's engagement
You
ring
around?
off
This
her
message was
own
I think you
mother's
should
finger.
see something.
The
Just
audio
that.
was perfectly
7
clear.
words. No
It's okay,
drama,
Mama.
no
I'm just
emotion.
gonna look at it.
Just a quiet
Don't
flag
worry.
in the
I
wind,
read it again.
signaling
My mother
that whatever
opened her
Ethan
mouth.
had assumed about the boundaries of this family
That's edited.
fracture.
That was the heart of it. Not that Mason had faced an emergency. Not that Patricia had accidentally used the wrong account. Not even that Heather had asked for help. Patricia had decided our ability to recover from a loss gave her permission to create the loss in the first place. Nathan looked at his father. Why didn't you send us this when you found out what she was doing? Walter's answer was quiet. Because if I told you, I had to tell you what I had done too. For the first time that evening, he stopped trying to defend himself. That honesty came late, but at least it came. I closed my notebook. We're going to request a full independent accounting. Walter nodded. We're going to determine every payment that was not for Lily. He nodded again. And Patricia cannot keep control of this trust if she believes this was acceptable. Walter's head lifted. Lauren. No, I'm not asking you to agree tonight. I'm telling you what I'm protecting. He looked toward Nathan. Nathan said, She's right. Walter's shoulders dropped. On the drive home, Nathan barely spoke. I knew he was grieving something different from what I was. Patricia's behavior angered him, but Walter's silence had broken a belief Nathan had carried his entire life. He had always described his father as passive, conflict avoidant, too willing to let Patricia decide things. Now we knew passivity had crossed into participation. When we reached home, I opened the evidence folder and added Walter's repayment records, his explanation, and the screenshot Patricia had sent him. Then I looked at the spreadsheet again. Until that night, I had been thinking in terms of recovery. How much had been taken? How much had Walter replaced? How much still belonged in Lily's account? But Patricia's message changed the question. If we recovered every dollar and left her with the same authority, nothing fundamental would be fixed. The balance was not the only thing that needed to be restored. The system had to change. And for the first time since that dinner, I knew exactly what I wanted next. Getting the money back was no longer enough. For the next few days, I kept telling myself the same thing. The trust records mattered, because they could prove what Patricia had done. What I had not understood yet was that Lily had already absorbed the part no spreadsheet could measure. I noticed it on a Wednesday evening when I came home from work and found her laptop exactly where it had been the night before, closed on the dining room table with her robotics notebook beside it. Before Patricia's dinner, Lily had carried that computer from room to room like an extra limb. She used it for homework, coding exercises, ridiculous little animation projects, and a robot she had been trying to program to turn around furniture without crashing into the wall. Now she had barely opened it in more than a week. I set my bag down and sat across from her. "How's the robot?" Lily kept coloring a diagram in her notebook. "Fine. Did you fix the turning problem?" "I can work on it at school. You usually like working on it here." She shrugged. "The school computers are okay." I waited. One thing my job had taught me was that silence could be useful when someone was avoiding the real answer. I had used that skill all week with bank records and family members, yet somehow I had failed to use it with my own daughter. After a minute, Lily put down her pencil and looked at the closed laptop. "Mom? Yeah? If I keep it, does Grandma really not want me to call her Grandma anymore?" Every number I'd spent the past 2 weeks chasing suddenly felt small. I moved my chair beside hers. "No adult gets to make you earn love by giving away something that belongs to you." "But she said Mason needs it more." "Mason needing something doesn't make your thing stop being yours." "What if sharing is the nice thing?" "Sharing can be nice when you choose it. If somebody tells you that you have to give something away or they won't love you anymore, that isn't sharing." Lily stared at the table. "I don't want Mason to think I'm selfish." "He doesn't." "How do you know?" "Because he told us he never wanted your laptop." She looked up. "Really? Really?" I hated that it took me that long to see what Patricia had done. I had been so focused on protecting Lily's future money that I'd missed the immediate damage sitting in front of me. Lily wasn't worried about 18 years from now. She was 9. She was trying to understand whether keeping her own computer meant losing her grandmother. Later that night, while Nathan was helping Lily with homework, I checked the family tablet to make sure Patricia had not tried to bypass the communication boundary again. One unread message had arrived before Nathan restricted the account. It was short. "Good girls share with family." I read it twice. There was no threat in the sentence. No profanity. No obvious cruelty. That almost made it worse. Patricia had taken the same idea she used with money and repackaged it in language a child could understand. If Lily kept something, she was not just refusing to share. She was failing a moral test. Nathan came into the kitchen while I still had the tablet in my hand. "What happened?" I showed him. His face hardened. "She sent that to Lily?" "Before we locked the account. I'm blocking everything." "I agree, but not because I want to punish her. I know why. Any contact with Lily goes through us now." Nathan nodded. "No direct messages, no calls
About to
alone,
fold.
and no using Heather
You
or
just
Dad
made an
to
enemy
pass
of this
anything to
family.
her." He
2
took the
weeks
tablet
later,
and
my
changed the
father
settings.
emailed me a single
There was a
paragraph
time when I would have
informing me
worried
I
about
was
whether
no
Patricia
longer
would call
welcome
that
at family
excessive.
gatherings
By
until
then,
I
I had
apologized
stopped
for the
measuring
scene at
boundaries
the
by how
hospital.
offended the person
I did
crossing
not
them might feel.
apologize.
The next afternoon,
I
Heather
started
called
no
me.
contact
She
on a
sounded
Tuesday in
uncomfortable.
early
It had
September
become
of
almost normal for
2023.
both of us.
What I did
"Mason
not
wants
know,
to talk to Lily."
what nobody
"About
told
what?"
me until
"The
2.5
laptop."
years
I
later,
hesitated.
was
"Did
that
Patricia
2
say
weeks
something to
after
him?"
that,
"No. He's been asking me since dinner whether Lily thinks he wanted it." That made sense. Patricia had put both children in a position neither of them chose. I told Heather I was comfortable with a short call if both of us stayed nearby. Mason appeared on the screen looking more embarrassed than I had ever seen an 11-year-old look. "Hi, Lily." "Hi." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say I didn't ask Grandma for your laptop." Lily looked at me, then back at him. "I know."
On hospital sketchpad. My ID badge was it showed me sitting in a chair. I had pulled my phone out only to check the time. On the subject line was my mother's voice, typed in Moyer's shaky handwriting, 5 words. Final terms for the return of mom's belongings. Lily, please read in full before responding. I said. I set the cup down before I read the first line.
After the call,
There I knew the cadence of her language, even in print. She started crying. She had been a Sunday school teacher at First Baptist Greer for 22 years.
Did he? He wanted more storage because his old one is slow. That is not the same thing as needing Lily's. I thought about the technology program Heather had mentioned, the retreat Mason hadn't wanted, the enrichment courses Patricia had pushed. She keeps deciding what he needs. Heather was quiet. Yeah, and then she decides who should pay for it. That silence lasted longer. "I'm starting to see that," Heather said. That evening, Nathan and I sat down after Lily went to bed and finally separated the problem into what we could fix and what we could not. Recovering money was straightforward in concept, even if the process would take time. The larger question was whether Patricia could ever be trusted with access again. "I don't want her controlling Lily's trust," I said. Nathan nodded. "Neither do I. Walter can't just take over either." Nathan looked at me, because he covered it up, because he proved that avoiding conflict matters more to him than enforcing the rules. Nathan leaned back. "So what are we actually asking for?" I took out the notebook I had been using since the week after the dinner. Full independent accounting, every transaction reviewed, any improper distribution restored. Okay. Patricia out as trustee. Yes. Walter out too. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then nodded. And the professional successor named in the trust takes over. Nathan looked at the page. That's not a small ask. No. She'll say we're trying to take control. We're doing the opposite. I don't want control. I want someone independent controlling it. That mattered to me. Patricia had spent years assuming every conflict was really a competition for authority. I was not interested in replacing her at the top of the system. I wanted the system to stop depending on family loyalty at all. The next morning, Nathan contacted a trust attorney recommended by our accountant. The attorney did not promise anything. He reviewed the trust language and told us there were several possible routes, but the first step was not a confrontation or a lawsuit. It was a complete accounting. Depending on what the records showed, voluntary resignation and a negotiated restoration could be cleaner and faster than a court fight. If Patricia refused, there were other remedies, but nobody was pretending those would happen overnight. The attorney referred us to a forensic accountant who had experience tracing trust distributions. We sent the documents we already had: annual accountings, the bank export, Patricia's authorization logs, Heather's invoices, Walter's repayment records, and the old message Patricia had sent him about Nathan and me being able to replace whatever Lily needed. The accountant called 2 days later. "I've started reconciling the transactions," she said. "You were right to flag the $4,875 payment." Nathan and I were both on speakerphone. "How many others?" I asked. "I'm not ready to give you a final number." That answer made my stomach tighten. "But there are several distributions tied to vendors that don't match expenses I can currently connect to Lily." Nathan looked at me. "How many several?" he asked. "I need the supporting records before I say. Some may turn out to be legitimate." I respected that she would not guess. Then she added, "But I don't think you've found all of them yet." After the call, I looked toward the dining room. Lily's laptop was still closed on the table, but this time her robotics notebook was open beside it. She had drawn a new wheel design in the margin. For the first time since the dinner, I understood exactly what I was protecting. It was never just the money. It was Lily's right to grow up without learning that being loved meant surrendering whatever someone else decided she could afford to lose. A week later, we sat down with Patricia and Walter in a private conference room at the attorney's office. I had expected Patricia to arrive angry. Instead, she came in calm, carrying a leather folder and wearing the expression she used whenever she believed everyone else had overreacted and she was about to restore order. That worried me more than yelling would have. By then, I had learned that Patricia was most dangerous when she sounded reasonable. Nathan sat beside me. Walter chose the chair across from him, but kept his eyes on the table. Heather had agreed to join us later if the conversation turned to the payments connected to Mason. The attorney had already explained that the purpose of the meeting was not to decide guilt in a room full of relatives. We were there to clarify facts, understand Patricia's position, and see whether there was any chance of resolving the trustee issue without forcing the matter into a longer legal process. Patricia opened first. I still think this has been blown completely out of proportion. I didn't answer the emotion. I opened my notebook instead. Did you authorize payments from Lily's trust for programs Mason attended? Patricia looked at me. I authorized
At the wedding, my mom texted
Also,
me.
they
Smug
made her
as ever.
sign something.
No punctuation.
The house deed.
Just her
That
signature,
joint
dashed like a
tenancy,
slap in the
Aunt Patty,
face,
and
wrapped in formal tone.
She told
I
me
didn't
she didn't
reply.
read.
I
She
logged
asked
into
her
my
Aunt Patty.
account,
There was a
transferred the $6,500 honeymoon funds back to myself, and canceled the business class flights I booked under her name.
What my mother
No
did not
shouting,
know
no
was that
drama.
the woman whose
Just a
signature
quiet
she had
little
just
click.
collected
By
had
morning, I
already,
had 23
11
missed
months
calls.
earlier, sat
But
in a
only one
downtown
me-
Of course I knew whose trust it was. Walter looked up at that. I felt something inside me settle. Not surprise. Confirmation. Did you know the expenses were not for Lily? Yes. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. Patricia crossed her arms. And before you both look at me like I robbed a bank, perhaps we could acknowledge reality. Lily has two parents with stable careers. She has savings. She has opportunities. She has never had to wonder whether she could afford a school program. Mason has. It wasn't your money to balance, Nathan said. Patricia's voice sharpened. It was family money. No, he said. It was Lily's. She is 9 years old. The room went quiet. Patricia continued. She doesn't even know what she has. She doesn't need 18 different advantages sitting untouched while Mason misses opportunities that could actually change his life. I stared at her. There was no apology in her voice because she wasn't speaking like someone who believed she had done something wrong. She was speaking like a person defending a policy. The trust exists for Lily's education, I said. And Lily's education is already covered. By us. Exactly. I leaned back. So because Nathan and I can provide for our daughter, you decided that made her trust available to someone else. I decided one child should not have everything while another has to struggle. That sentence told me more than any bank record had.
Brenda
Patricia
put the
wasn't
stamp
claiming
back
she
in her
had
bag.
misunderstood the trust
She
language.
walked out of the
She
room
wasn't
without
claiming
saying a
she had
word.
clicked the wrong account.
My mother's
She
face
wasn't
turned
even
the
claiming
color of
Walter
cooked
had
beef.
approved every transaction.
She stood up,
Her defense
smoothed
was
her
that the
cardigan,
difference between our
picked up the
financial
folder,
situation
and motioned me into
gave
the
her a
hallway
moral
with two
right to
fingers.
override the
In the
difference
hallway,
between
she did
Lily's
not raise her
property and
voice.
Mason's needs.
My mother never
Nathan
raised
looked at
her
his
voice
mother.
in public.
What happens when
She
Mason
leaned in
needs
close
something
enough
and
that I could smell her
Patricia
morning
frowned.
coffee.
That
You don't
depends.
understand what we're trying
On
to
what?
protect her from.
On what he needs.
From what,
And who
Mom?
decides
Bed at
that?
night.
That
I
overly
use
formal
She did it
tone
because
she
she was a
used
good
when she
daughter.
wanted to sound
She did it
above
on
the
an
chaos
iPad
she
signed
often
into an
created,
Apple
Someone
ID that
has
as though she
uploaded
were a
every
school
minute of
principal
footage
handing
to
down a
family
suspension,
iCloud drive
rather
she had
than a
never
mother
logged
cutting
into
out
in
her
her
own
life.
son from a family
She had hung a
milestone.
camera in
The room
room,
felt unusually
and then she
quiet,
had pointed it
as if
at
the air
herself.
itself had paused to
Cassandra
see what he
texted
would do
me on a
next.
Wednesday.
But
She
Ethan
was
didn't
wearing a
move.
camel trench
He
coat.
didn't pace. He didn't write a furious email or
Want to
call
lose weight
anyone.
without losing muscle?
Instead,
Factor
he
got me
opened
there.
a blank
I
document
was
on
tired
his
of all the
laptop
cutting and bulking
and typed
cycles.
Every
Edit.
email she had
You know
ever
that.
sent
All
me
this
opened the
time?
same
I know.
way. I
And
thought
who
you
started
had
it?
Lily.
You did.
Your father
I
stayed on my
Patricia
phone
looked
prayed
at her
about
because
43
Heather had
months.
just proven her case.
We're prepared to hear what was your
happening.
grandmother left for
Heather's
you.
voice stayed
but
quiet.
only after you come
I
about
also
Juliet's
asked you to stop.
essay, face us in person,
Patricia
about the letter
turned back.
Marlowe had
Apologized
on
You
video.
were embarrassed.
3 months. She listened without
That was
speaking.
how long
my grandmother had been
At
in the
the
ground,
end, I
she
needed to
said.
figure things
I
out
scrolled.
myself.
What do you need me to
You
do?
were
41
raising a
I
child
told her
once.
I would call her
I
back. I
know
read
what
them
I was
once the
doing.
way
There
you
was
read a
something
lab
I
report
had to
for a
do.
patient you don't
On the
know yet.
evening
of March
Heather
says,
flinched,
drug-free
and I saw the old
workplace,
dynamic in real
random
time.
testing in effect.
Patricia offered
I
help.
had passed my
Then
December
used the
screen
history of
3
that
weeks
help as
earlier.
evidence that
I
nobody
called
else
my
could
old
be
church
trusted
friend
with their
Bethany
own
on
decisions.
speakerphone and
Heather
asked
looked
her
down at her
gently
hands.
what people
Maybe
were
I was
saying.
overwhelmed.
She paused
Patricia
for a
softened
long
slightly,
time.
as if
She
she'd
said,
won. Then
Patty
Heather
says
added,
you've been
"That
struggling
doesn't
with
mean you got to
substances
decide
and
Lily's
toxic
trust."
influences.
Patricia's
She
expression
says they've
changed.
had to set hard
I never
boundaries
asked
to
you to
protect
use
Mama.
Lily's trust, Heather said.
Substances
I thought you and
and
Dad were
toxic
paying.
influence.
We were helping. No, you were deciding. Patricia looked at Walter. He said nothing. Then she turned on me. This is what Lauren wanted. I almost laughed, but I didn't. What exactly did I want? To prove she doesn't need this family. You've always been proud of that. There was enough truth in the accusation that I didn't dismiss it. You're right about one part, I said. I was proud of not needing the trust. I was so proud of it that I barely looked at the statements. That was a mistake. Nathan glanced at me. Patricia opened her hands. There. Even she admits she didn't care about the money. I said I didn't watch it closely enough. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. I leaned forward. My mistake was believing that because we didn't need to spend the money, I didn't need to protect it. Your mistake was believing that because we didn't need it, you had permission to use it. Patricia stared at me. I continued, those are not equal mistakes. Walter shifted in his chair. Patricia looked away first. Then she said, fine. The word came out clipped and final. If this is really about the money, I'll replace it. Nobody answered. All of it, she said. Whatever your accountant decides is missing. I'll replace every dollar. Nathan looked at me. Patricia noticed. There. Problem solved. I waited. Then she added the part I knew was coming. But this ends here. No dragging the family through some ridiculous removal process. No outside trustee. No treating me like a criminal. I put the money back. Everyone moves on. The offer hung in the room longer than I expected. I understood why people accepted deals like that. It was clean. It avoided legal bills, months of arguments, and the humiliation of forcing parents and children to choose sides. If all I wanted was the balance restored, Patricia had just offered me an exit. But I had seen Lily afraid to open her own laptop. I had seen Walter repay money in secret because confronting Patricia had felt harder. I had watched Heather explain that help had become another way for Patricia to make decisions for her. The account balance was only one symptom. We'll respond after the accounting is complete, I said. Patricia frowned. What is there to think about? A lot. If I replace every dollar, you have no reason to keep attacking me. I'm not agreeing to anything today. Patricia looked at Nathan. And you're going to let her do this? Nathan's face hardened. We are doing this together. That ended the meeting. In the car, Nathan didn't start the engine right away. He kept both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. If she pays all of it back, he said. Are we still asking her to step down? Yes. He looked at me. I didn't hesitate. If she still thinks she had the right to take it, then yes. Nathan nodded slowly. My phone buzzed before we reached home. It was an email from the forensic accountant. The subject line read, Preliminary findings pattern confirmed. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. Whatever Patricia wanted us to call generosity, the records were about to tell us exactly how far she had taken it. The accountant's preliminary report arrived the next morning, and for the first time since we started digging through Lily's trust, I saw the entire pattern in one place. The total amount Patricia had directed toward expenses connected to Mason was $18,760. Walter had quietly put about $5,000 back over time, which meant the account balance had been partially repaired, but that did not erase the transactions themselves. The report separated legitimate Lily expenses from unsupported ones, listed the vendors, matched payment dates to invoices, and identified which trustee account authorized each distribution. Seeing the number bothered me, but not as much as seeing how ordinary the pattern looked on paper. Patricia had not emptied the trust in one dramatic transfer. She had taken smaller pieces over years, each one easy enough to explain away if nobody looked closely. The accountant walked Nathan and me through the findings on a video call. She was careful with her language. She did not call Patricia a thief, and she did not pretend to know whether every questionable entry would ultimately be treated the same way legally. She told us what the records showed. Several payments were tied directly to programs Mason had attended. The $4,875 enrichment payment was the clearest match, but it was not the only one. There were smaller payments for a technology course, an academic retreat, tutoring, and another enrichment program. Some had been partially offset later by deposits Walter made from an account under his control. Nathan rubbed his forehead. Were all of these emergencies? The accountant looked down at her notes. That's not something the financial records can answer. You'll need context from the family. Heather gave us that context later the same day. I sent her the list of programs without the financial totals at first. I wanted to know which ones she remembered and which ones Mason had actually needed. She called me within 20 minutes. "The weekend retreat," she said. "Mom wanted that. I didn't." "What about the technology course?" "Mason hated it." I looked at Nathan. Heather continued. "He stopped going after a few weeks. I told Mom I wasn't paying for another session, and she said I was giving up too easily. I pulled up the corresponding trust entry. She paid another session." Heather went quiet. "What about the summer enrichment program?" I told her it was too expensive. "Did Mason want to go?" "Not really. He wanted to stay home and do an art program with one of his friends." That changed something for me. Patricia had spent weeks telling everyone she had used Lily's money because Mason desperately needed opportunities Heather could not afford. The records showed something different. Some of those opportunities were things Patricia herself had selected, promoted, and insisted on after Heather or Mason hesitated. "She wasn't just helping when you were in trouble," I said. Heather exhaled. "No. She was deciding what counted as trouble." "I know." Her voice sounded tired rather than angry. Then she said, "I thought
A
she
part
was
written
helping
by
me
my
stand
mother.
up. I think she was
I would
making
have to
sure I
find
never
that one
had
myself.
to." That
The honor
sentence
committee
stayed with me.
process began on
Heather
March
had spent
4th.
years feeling ashamed
I
that she
drafted a
needed
formal
help.
request and sent it to
Patricia had spent
Marlo.
those same years
I
trying
asked
help
the
as
committee
proof
to
that
compare
Heather
my
could not
submitted
manage
personal
without her.
statement from the
Everything
2025
strengthened
cycle with
both
Juliet's
stories at
submitted
once.
personal
"What are
statement
you
from the
going to do?"
2024
I asked.
cycle,
Heather took a moment
specifically the
before
paragraphs
answering.
referencing
"I'm
a
not taking
pediatric
anything else from her
oncology
unless I
patient.
know exactly where it comes
I
from."
attached my
"That's
original
probably
draft
smart."
document from spring
No.
2020.
I mean, I'm done with the regular help. School stuff, activities, all of it. If Mason does something, I need to know I can pay for it. You don't have to prove anything to me. I'm not doing it for you. I almost smiled. Good. That was the Heather I wanted to see. Not indebted to me because I had cleared her. Not trying to earn my approval. Just finally making one decision Patricia had not made first. Walter called Nathan that evening. He had already heard that the accounting total was larger than we originally thought. "I'll cover what's missing," he said. Nathan put the call on speaker. "Dad, you already tried that. This is different." "How?" "We know the total now." I stepped in before the conversation turned into another argument about intentions. "Walter, how restoration is funded is something the agreement and the attorneys can deal with. You contributing may be appropriate, but putting money back still doesn't answer who should control the trust afterward." Walter was silent. I continued. "You spent years trying to fix the balance quietly. That cannot be the solution again." He did not argue. After a while, he said, "I'll step down." Nathan looked at me. Walter added, "If the professional successor is willing to take over, I won't fight it." It was the first time since dinner that Walter chose something before Patricia forced the choice on him. Patricia responded very differently. 2 days later, Nathan received a message from his aunt. Then another from a cousin. Then one from someone I had met perhaps 3 times in 12 years. Apparently, Patricia had sent an email to the extended family saying I was trying to take control of the children's money. She claimed Nathan was letting me push his parents out of a trust that had always been managed responsibly, and suggested the entire dispute began because I resented how much help Heather received. Nathan read the email twice. "She's making it sound like you want to become trustee." "I don't." "I know. I specifically want none of us controlling it." He looked at me. "Do we answer?" I thought about it. A month earlier, I might have wanted to send everything. The invoices, the screenshot, Walter's repayment records, Patricia's old message about us being able to replace whatever Lily needed. There was enough material to humiliate her in every family group chat she had ever controlled. Instead, Nathan and I sent one short response to the relatives Patricia had pulled into the situation. An independent accounting had confirmed that funds from Lily's education trust had been used for expenses belonging to another child. We were following the trust's formal process and would not be circulating private financial documents or debating the matter socially. That was all. Patricia wanted an argument about who was more loyal to the family. I had no interest in giving her one. Our attorney suggested one final meeting before anyone moved toward a court petition. The trust already named a professional successor if both family trustees resigned, so there was a cleaner route available if Patricia agreed to step down, and the restoration amount could be resolved through written terms. Walter had already said he would resign. Patricia had not. Heather called me the night before the meeting. Mom called me. What did she want? She said once everyone calmed down, I should explain that she only did this because Mason needed help. I waited. Heather gave a short laugh. She still thinks I'm her best argument. What did you tell her? I told her Mason didn't ask for half those programs. And she said I'm rewriting history because you got into my head. That sounded like Patricia. Heather went quiet, then said, if she says it tomorrow, I'm answering her. I knew exactly what she meant. For weeks, Patricia had defended every transaction with the same shield. Mason needed it. Heather needed help. She was the grandmother willing to make hard choices nobody else would make. But the accounting had stripped away the vague language. $18,760. Vendor by vendor, program by program. Some Heather had never requested. Some Mason had never wanted. The only person who had consistently decided they were necessary was Patricia. And the next day, for the first time, the person she claimed to have been saving was going to tell her that out loud. The final family meeting happened in the same conference room where Patricia had offered to put the money back and call the problem solved. This time, the room felt different before anyone spoke. The forensic accountant sat at one end of the table with a thin folder instead of the stack of papers I had imagined months earlier, and our trust attorney sat beside her. Nathan and I took the same side. Heather sat near me. Walter sat across from Nathan. Patricia chose the chair at the head of the table, which felt so perfectly like her that I almost smiled. The accountant began with facts and nothing else. She explained that the review had identified $18,760 in distributions from Lily's trust that were connected to Mason's expenses rather than Lily's. Walter had later replenished about $5,000. Patricia's trustee credentials had authorized most of the direct vendor payments. Walter had approved the first reimbursement 3 years earlier. The accountant did not call anyone a thief. She did not speculate about motives. She simply explained what the records showed and answered 2 questions about dates. Then the attorney explained the options. Patricia and Walter could resign voluntarily, allowing the professional successor already named in the trust to take over. A written restoration agreement could resolve the remaining financial issues. If that failed, other legal remedies remained available, including asking a court to intervene. Nobody promised how long that would take or how a judge would rule on every detail. Once the professionals finished, the room stopped being about documents and became a family again. Patricia turned to me first. I hope you're satisfied. I kept my hands folded on the table. With what? With humiliating everyone. Nathan said, Mom, the accountant just finished explaining what happened. I heard her. Then stop pretending Lauren created it. Patricia looked at him with the same expression she used whenever he disappointed her by refusing to agree. This could have been handled privately. Instead, your wife brought in accountants and attorneys and made your father feel like a criminal. Walter looked down. I said, private is how this lasted. Patricia's attention snapped back to me. Don't twist this into something ugly. You always resented that we helped Heather. Heather shifted beside me. Patricia continued before she could speak. You never understood what it was like for her. You and Nathan had 2 incomes. You bought Lily a $1,600 computer without blinking. Heather was trying to keep Mason in programs that could give him a future. I could hear the old argument rebuilding itself exactly the way Patricia needed it. I didn't interrupt. She leaned forward. Everything I did was for Mason. Heather pushed her chair back. The sound of the legs against the floor cut through the room. Stop using my son as your excuse. Patricia stared at her. Excuse me? I said stop using Mason as your excuse. I was helping you. You were deciding for me. You couldn't afford half of what he needed. Heather's face flushed, but she did not back down. Sometimes I couldn't. Sometimes I told you I didn't want the program. Sometimes Mason didn't want it either. Patricia shook her head. Children don't always know what opportunities matter. That doesn't mean Lily pays for them. Patricia's mouth tightened. Heather continued. I never asked you to take money from her trust. I never knew you were doing it. You told me you and Dad were paying. We were helping family. No, you were making sure I stayed grateful. Patricia looked wounded. After everything I have done for you. That is what you think? Heather swallowed. I think I depended on you too much. That part is on me. But maybe I was dependent. That didn't make Lily responsible for me. For once, Patricia had no immediate answer. Then she turned toward Walter. Say something. Walter lifted his eyes. I had watched him avoid conflict for years. He would change subjects, leave rooms, make quiet jokes, or offer money to soften whatever Patricia had done. Even after we found the trust payments, part of me expected him to retreat one more time. He didn't. I should have said something 3 years ago. Patricia froze. Walter looked at Nathan. I approved the first payment. I knew what it was. I told myself it was temporary. Then, when Patricia continued, I tried to put money back instead of telling you. Patricia's voice sharpened. You told me you understood why I did it. I understood why you said you did it. That's the same thing. No. The word came out quietly, but it changed the room. Walter went on. I should have stopped it the first time. I should have told Nathan and Lauren when I realized it continued. I didn't because I didn't want the fight. Patricia looked at him as if he had broken a contract no one else had known existed. So now you're against me too. Walter shook his head. I'm responsible for what I did. Patricia leaned back. Fine, then we fix it. I already offered. We replace the money. Nathan said, You keep saying that like it ends the problem. It should. I spoke before Patricia could turn the conversation again. The money is one thing. You still think you had the right to take it. Her eyes narrowed. I think I had the right to help my grandson. With Lily's money. With family resources. There it is. Patricia's jaw tightened. I kept my voice calm. You still don't believe you crossed a line. You believe the line shouldn't exist because Nathan and I could replace whatever Lily lost. Patricia said nothing. That is why you cannot stay trustee. Her face hardened completely. You are not removing me from my own family's trust. The attorney stepped in only then. The trust provides for a professional successor if both current trustees resign. Walter has indicated he is willing to resign. If there is no voluntary resolution, there are other procedures available. Nobody is asking you to decide this second. Patricia looked at Walter. You agreed to resign? Yes. You didn't even discuss that with me? Walter gave a tired laugh. That's exactly the problem, Patricia. I've spent too many years thinking every decision had to survive a discussion with you first. She turned back to Nathan. And you're going to let strangers manage money your grandfather left for his family? Nathan answered without looking at me. I'd rather have a professional follow the trust than have family decide which child deserves another child's money. Patricia stared at him for a long time. Then she looked at the attorney. If I resign, this stays out of court? The attorney answered carefully. If the resignation, successor transition, accounting issues, and restoration terms are resolved in writing, a contested petition may not be necessary. And if I don't, then Nathan and Lauren have options available to pursue on Lily's behalf. Patricia went silent. She did not apologize. She did not admit she had been wrong. What she did was calculate. Finally, she said, Have your attorney draft whatever you think you need. The attorney corrected her gently. The agreement will reflect the accounting and the trust terms. You should have independent counsel review it. Patricia looked irritated by even that suggestion, but she nodded. The battle was not over. Nothing had been signed. The money had not been restored. The professional successor had not taken control. But the structure Patricia had relied on was already cracking. As we stood to leave, she looked at me one last time. If you do this, don't expect me to pretend everything is normal with Lily. A month earlier, that sentence might have frightened me because I would have heard it as a threat to my daughter. Now I heard it as confirmation. Normal is what got us here. Heather picked up her bag. And I'm not doing every holiday at your house anymore. Patricia turned. What is that supposed to mean? It means I can host too. Heather walked out before Patricia could explain why that was somehow an attack. Nathan and I left together. Walter remained behind for a moment, probably to speak with the attorney. My phone buzzed before we reached the parking lot. Patricia had sent me a message. You turned everyone against me. I read it once and locked the screen. For years, Patricia had believed the family stayed together because she held everyone in place. That afternoon, for the first time, I think she realized they had been staying partly because nobody wanted to be the first person to step away. Nothing changed overnight after that meeting. Patricia did not lose access to Lily's trust the moment she walked out of the conference room, and no one transferred $18,000 back by dinner. The next several weeks were quieter than the confrontation and, in some ways, more important. Attorneys exchanged drafts. The forensic accountant clarified numbers. Walter signed his resignation first. Patricia objected to wording, asked for revisions, and repeatedly tried to frame the process as something Nathan and I had forced on everyone. Eventually, after her own attorney reviewed the agreement and the remaining restoration amount was fixed in writing, she signed too. The trust had already named a professional successor, so once both
At the time, it had seemed like a small favor. One of many. He clicked
The old
cancel.
one Aunt Marianne
The page
set up
processed
in
for a
2015.
moment before
And remember
confirming the
password.
refund,
Patricia
$3,800
saw the reply
deposited back to his
Already on
account
it.
within
From
5
That
to 7
family
business
Apple
days.
ID had been on
He moved
Aunt
on to his
Marianne's
banking
phone
app,
before she died.
found the transfer
It had
record
been
from
on
3
Walter's.
weeks prior,
It had been on
$6,500 wired
It
to
had been on
Marilyn's
mine.
account, marked
My
as
mother had never
wedding
used
gift
it because
honeymoon
my mother
support.
believed iCloud
He
was a
reversed
place
it.
for criminals.
We had ever cared about. The restoration agreement handled the remaining shortfall over the schedule the attorneys approved, along with the professional costs allocated under the settlement. I never asked which marital account Patricia used or how she and Walter divided responsibility inside their own finances. That was not my job. My job was making sure Lily's trust was restored and no longer controlled by people who had treated it like a family emergency fund. Walter accepted his removal more quietly. I did not forgive him simply because he finally cooperated. He had approved the first improper reimbursement. He had recognized later misuse and chosen secret deposits instead of honesty. But once the evidence was undeniable, he stopped trying to defend his position. He gave the accountant the records she requested, signed his resignation, and stopped asking Nathan to protect Patricia from the consequences. Patricia did the opposite. She sent Nathan messages insisting the successor trustee was unnecessary. She said a stranger would never understand family priorities. She told Heather that professional management would make everything colder and more complicated. Every argument only proved the point she still refused to see. The trust did not need someone who understood family priorities. It needed someone willing to follow its rules. Heather changed too, though not dramatically enough to make her life suddenly easy. She did not find a perfect new career, pay off every bill, or become financially independent in a week. She simply started saying no. When Patricia offered to pay for Mason's next summer program, Heather declined. When Patricia sent her information about another academic course Mason had never asked for, Heather told her she would decide with her son what he actually wanted and what she could afford. One night, Heather called me and laughed without much humor. "Mom says I'm letting pride hurt Mason." "What did you say?" I told her maybe I need a little pride. I smiled. "How did that go?" "Badly." "Sounds healthy." Heather laughed for real that time. Nathan and I kept the same rule with Lily. Patricia did not contact her directly. She could speak to Nathan or me as adults, but there were no private calls, no messages through relatives, and no attempts to make Lily responsible for restoring the relationship. Patricia called that cruel. I called it temporary distance from someone who had told a child that grandmotherly love depended on surrendering property. By July, Heather did something Patricia had always treated as almost unthinkable. She hosted lunch. It was not a grand announcement or an organized boycott. She invited Nathan, me, Lily, Mason, and a few relatives who had stayed out of the conflict. Walter came for part of the afternoon after confirming with Heather that she was comfortable with it. Patricia was not invited. Heather did not tell her, "This is your punishment." She simply stopped, assuming every family gathering belonged at Patricia's house. That difference mattered. For years, Patricia had been the center by default. Her dining table, her holidays, her rules, her money filling whatever gaps she decided existed. That Sunday, we ate pasta from mismatched bowls in Heather's smaller dining room, while Mason complained that Lily's robot was cheating because she had changed the wheel design after he gave her advice. "You told me to make it wider," Lily said. I said slightly wider. You didn't specify. That's cheating by technicality. That's still not cheating. The two of them argued until Heather told them both to eat. Nobody mentioned the laptop. Nobody mentioned the trust. Nobody asked who deserved more. I noticed Walter watching the children for a while. He looked tired, but he did not try to turn the moment into a speech about family healing. I appreciated that. He was learning, slowly, that being present was not the same as being absolved. Patricia called me several weeks later. I almost let it go to voicemail, then decided I was tired of avoiding one final conversation. What do you want, Patricia? Her voice was controlled. I want to know whether you're satisfied. With what? With what you did. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Be specific. You pushed me out of the trust. Heather barely speaks to me unless she needs something. Walter acts like everything is his fault. Nathan won't bring Lily
During
over.
their courtship, you watched her die.
Everyone
Sick
said
paragraph
the
from
spring.
Mother
I had been
1957.
expecting those
That
words
before
as
they
soon as
married in
she said after the family
1958.
reunion.
That is a decision
There
you
was the
made
sapphire
over my
engagement
engagement
ring
ring
he
he
had
had
bought
bought
her
her
in
in
Charleston.
Charleston. You don't
I
have to
didn't
do
ask
this
Walter
tomorrow.
to
There was
stop
the purple
covering
heart
her.
he had
It
earned
began
outside
with
Hughes
I
City
stopped
in
protecting
1968.
Nathan.
And
She
never
hushed
spoken
went
of
quiet.
once. I saved the
She
call. There was
said,
a family
"You
Bible
think you're
from
better than me."
1911-18. My mother left
always
great-great-grandparents
No.
written in a
I
copper
think
plate.
you
12
can.
seconds.
She
Elizabeth, there was a
humiliated me
recipe
over
book. Listen
money
to
we
me.
didn't
Keeping
deserve.
since she
If
got married. You do this
there it
tomorrow.
was again. Not money Lily owned. Money we did not need. You still don't understand, I said. I understand perfectly. No, Patricia. If you did, you wouldn't keep saying that. Her voice hardened. Are you happy now? I thought about it before answering. No. Lily is safe. That's enough. I ended the call before she could turn it into another trial of who had sacrificed more for the family. That evening, I heard typing from the dining room. For a second, I did not think anything of it. Then I realized I had not heard that particular fast, uneven rhythm in weeks. Lily had opened her laptop. Her robotics kit was spread across the table, wires running between a small sensor board and the wheeled frame she had nearly abandoned. On the screen was the coding program she had stopped using after Patricia's dinner. I sat across from her. You working on the turning problem? I fixed most of it. Most? It still hits the chair sometimes. That seems like a chair problem. She gave me a look. That's not how robots work. Apparently I had failed as an engineer. She rotated the laptop toward me and showed me a drawing Mason had sent. He had suggested moving one of the sensors outward to give it a wider field of detection. He actually had a good idea, she admitted. Don't tell him that. I won't. She went back to typing. I did not tell her how much the moment meant to me. I had learned by then that children should not have to carry the emotional weight of adult victories either. The laptop did not need to become a symbol for Lily, it only needed to become hers again. By late August, nearly 3 months had passed since the professional successor formally took over the trust. Patricia still had not apologized in any way I would call genuine. She had said she regretted how messy things became. She had said she wished Nathan and I had handled it differently. She had even said she never intended to hurt Lily. What she had not said was the one thing that mattered. I had no right to decide Lily could afford to lose what belonged to her. Maybe she would say it someday. Maybe she would not. Heather was still learning to make decisions without hearing Patricia's voice in every financial problem. Nathan had stopped brushing off the smaller boundary violations he had once called just mom. Walter no longer pretended silence made him neutral. And Lily no longer left the laptop untouched on the dining room table. Looking back, my biggest mistake had not been trusting Patricia. It had been believing independence meant staying away from anything connected to her family because I did not want to look interested in their money. I had thought strength meant proving we could provide everything ourselves. Now I understood it differently. Sometimes strength meant reading the paperwork you had ignored. Sometimes it meant admitting your first assumption about someone was wrong. Sometimes it meant refusing an easy repayment because the person offering it still believed they had every right to do the same thing again. And sometimes it meant looking someone directly in the eye and saying, "This belongs to my child. You do not get to decide she can afford to lose it." That night, Lily tested the robot across the dining room floor while her laptop sat open beside her. It turned too sharply, bumped one chair leg, corrected itself, and kept going. So did we. You should never confuse generosity with surrendering your rights. Helping family is a choice, not permission for someone else to take your money, property, or opportunities because they think you can afford the loss. If a relative manages money for your child, read the statements, ask questions, keep records, and speak up when something does not match. Financial stability does not make your boundaries less important, and love should never be used to pressure a child into giving up what belongs to them. When you discover wrongdoing, focus on evidence, correct your assumptions when facts change, and choose solutions that prevent the behavior from happening again instead of accepting an apology or repayment. You do not need to humiliate anyone to hold them accountable. Protect the vulnerable person, fix the system, and let consequences follow the choices that were made. If you value stories with lessons, subscribe to the channel